We are live, ma'am. You can begin.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the third episode of PCOS Science Live. We bring you this PCOS Science Live program basically to get our young postgraduates and young clinicians interested in the field of research. We interview speakers who have had high impact publications in journals which are well read, and these are the kinds of research we bring to you so that you get inspired by them, as to learn from them as to what they went through, how did they get the idea of doing that research, and how did they proceed, what challenges they faced, etc., etc. I would like to tell you that PCOS is a subject which is definitely a subject wherein there's a lot of mental health issues. There are girls with issues related to their body image, it's related to their obesity, to their acne, to the hirsutism, to the alopecia, and so many other issues which they have, that they have mental health is something which we really need to assess in these girls. And when we have girls who are trying to look at the media and try and get motivated by the models they see on TV and want to look like them, this is something which we need to make sure that girls, sort of are kept away from such kind of media. We cannot keep them away, but we need to explain to them and acknowledge their problems and take care of them. Recently, I had a young girl, only 18 years old, and she had a BMI of 15. She had stopped getting her menstrual periods for the last 1 year. And when I talked to her, I realized that she had lost something like 20 kilos in 4 months. She had gone on a very crash diet trying to achieve size 0. And when I looked at her, I knew definitely there's something wrong with this girl. And therefore, we must understand that this excessive obsession about trying to be like someone, trying to look like someone, is something which we definitely need to address. And therefore, we do not know what really goes on in their brain. Why does it affect their reproductive system? Why do they go into amenorrhea? Why do they have eating disorders? Why do they have so many issues which we are not able to explain today? And today we have with us two brilliant speakers who have done a lot of work on mental health. And these two brilliant speakers are with us today, who have had their, a lot of research which they have done. And they come from two different backgrounds. One of them is from the laboratory side, who has been working on animal experiments. And then we have the clinician, the clinical research person, who has been doing a lot of studies in women, especially women with PCOS. Of course, mental health can be an issue in any human being for various reasons. But we must also understand that PCOS is also associated with mood changes, with emotional disorders, etc. So let me introduce to you Dr. Anuja Dokras, who comes to us from the University of Pennsylvania. I'm sure all our Indian population knows her by now. She's so well associated with us at the PCOS Society of India. She was the one who launched the society for us 5 years ago. And she is the one who has been doing a lot of work in mental health related to PCOS. The second speaker who is with us is Professor Vidita Vaidya, who is with us from the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Mumbai. And she's had her undergraduate training in life science and chemistry at St. Xavier's College in Mumbai, and PhD at the Yale University with fellowships from Karolinska Institute and Oxford University. She has received many awards, and I think both our speakers have had brilliant awards. And she is committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion in the sciences. So welcome both Anuja and Vidita to this third episode of the PCOS Science Live. And we will now, first of all, I'd like to start with Professor Vidita and talk to her about her research, But before I ask her to talk about her research, I know Vidita for many, many years, and I know her parents even better. Her parents are Dr. Vaidya, whom I respect a lot, and Dr. Ashok Vaidya, who was the head of Siba Gaigi in those days, and then which got into Novartis. But Dr. Rama Vaidya was from the NIRRH, and they did a lot of research together. And they're still, at this age of 80 plus, are doing a lot of research together. So therefore, Vidita, who's their only daughter, will have inherited all the genes of her parents, and with her hard work and with her brilliant mind, she has been able to achieve quite a lot. All along the way, she has published very, very good articles in journals, and she has actually been awarded the most prestigious awards which I can think of. So, Vidita, tell me, which of your awards have been the most precious to you?
So I'd say the one that I got last year, which is the Nature Award for Excellence in Mentorship, because that's one where I was nominated by my mentees, and that was the most precious of every award ever, because it's a recognition that your mentorship has mattered, and that perhaps is a much longer legacy than any work you do. The work you do is sometimes transient, but the mentorship is can go on for generations. So that one's the most precious.
Absolutely. But then what made you decide to come back to India? You were at the Karolinska, you were at Yale University, you were at Oxford University, wherever, so many brilliant academic institutions. What made you come back to India?
I mean, this is a good question to start with the older generation. You know, my mother was 8 months pregnant when she came back. And I kept telling my mother, I said, you know, what if you delivered me on the plane 8 months pregnant? I don't think people are allowed to fly at that point anymore. So my my parents were also at Yale doing their fellowships, doing their assistant professorships. And they returned when I was in utero. And, you know, I often ask my parents, why did you do it then? Right. But there's a tie to this. This is just home. You know, this is home. I wanted to be home, and I felt that I had the opportunity to perhaps also contribute back to a system that I had gained immensely from. And I saw no reason why we can't do cutting edge science in India. It's changing. The ecosystem is so dramatically changing. And, you know, now you can see it, because there are a lot of people who are interested in coming back to the academic space in India as well. So I'm not that unusual. There are a lot of people now who are like me, who are making this sort of return journey. So, yeah, I mean, it was home. The simple answer is I just wanted to come home.
But did you have a choice?
I mean, I would have always had a choice, no question about it. I'm sure if I put in my applications in the US, I was part of a community that there was a strong mentorship with, and I've had other people who I worked with take on faculty positions there. I just didn't even take that step, because once I took that step, I knew it would be just too difficult and too tempting.
Absolutely.
And then, I had to be decided in my mind. And so I wasn't going to give myself this situation where I would now be in a debate. I just didn't even apply anywhere else. I just looked at India and I said, I'm going home. That was it.
Absolutely wonderful. So take a bow and I'm so happy you came back to India. Otherwise, India would have lost a great scientist in Vidita. So Vidita, tell us something about your research, what you've been doing at the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research.
So the fundamental part of it is key. I'm a basic neurobiologist. I'm interested in how circuits in the brain that regulate emotional states that are associated with anxiety or depression, can we study them in animal models? And we can study them in rats and mice. We cannot produce the full disease, but we can understand the sort of underlying endophenotypes of the disease, because that can be modeled in animals. We can also look at how drugs that treat depression or other interventional strategies like exercise or sometimes fast-acting antidepressant therapy, how does that actually impact the brain? And I want to mention why this is important is because most of the treatments used today clinically, which are marketed routinely, while we have their primary target of action, we really don't have an underlying mechanism. They were discovered serendipitously. We sort of built on them and honed them, but the underlying mechanisms are still very poorly understood. And there's much to be done in the fundamental basic research space as well. So if I was to describe my work, I would say there are two central questions. I ask how life experience, in particular stressful life experience in early life, will predispose you towards a psychopathological state in adulthood associated with disorders like anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. And I also study how drugs that treat these disorders actually exert their behavioral effects using animal models. We're now beginning to start the translational journey in collaboration with colleagues at NIMHANS, where we look at human neurons derived from induced pluripotent stem cells. So we can translate what we do in the animal model to at least a quasi-clinical associated material, because these are patient-derived samples. But we are about sort of 10 years away from the direct clinical application, 10, 15 years away, because we're at the very basic end of things. And our work takes time to translate eventually to the clinic. But I think it's a beautiful continuum. And there's room for dialogue back and forth between basic scientists and clinicians. We are informed by the clinic, and the clinic is informed by our findings. So it's a two-way street in many ways.
Yeah. You had a small presentation to make, and you wanted to explain, how the brain functions, so it becomes easier for our viewers to understand what is the current concept, because quite a few of us have done the brain when we were doing anatomy and physiology. So we'd like to get an update on this.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of epochs of life. So in the very next slide, you're going to actually see that there are stages of life where the brain is undergoing major reorganization. The brain is so plastic. It's very responsive to the environment and actually undergoes structural, epigenetic, and functional change in that early window. So in utero, obviously it's developing then, so it's most sensitive. In infancy and childhood, it continues to be highly sensitive. But it's not as though it shuts down after that. Adolescence and adulthood stay extremely important windows where environment has a profound influence on the brain. And then the aging brain is something that we are fundamentally quite interested in terms of how do we protect it? How do we protect the aging nervous system? So in the next slide, I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the kinds of things that can happen in the brain. So the next slide. So obviously, I don't need to tell the clinicians that the early windows are the most critical. Okay. If you do something wrong in that window, stress has profound, long-term, lifelong influences. On the left-hand side are panels from the brain from a rodent model, where a rodent model receiving poor quality or fragmented maternal care actually shows cell death in the brain. On the right-hand side is PET imaging from a human being. So these are young children that had, maltreatment in early life, either abuse or neglect. And you can see associated with that decline in activity in temporal regions of the brain that are associated with the control of mood. Next slide. So why do I want to bring this up? I want to bring this up even in the context of PCOS. It's not as though it's only this window programming behavioral mood-related changes. This window and stress in this window can also program metabolic disorders. And it is well known that diet, environment, and stress in that early developmental window, right from infancy, in utero, infancy, childhood, and adolescence, can actually shape risk, not just for psychiatric diseases, but for metabolic diseases and diseases associated with insulin resistance. So this window is critical. And from a public health perspective, or even from a perspective of interventional strategies, the earlier you intervene and the earlier you bring in lifestyle modification, the longer, the better the impact. So this window will become very critical for organizations like the PCOS Society to think about. Can you intervene before someone hits puberty? Can you get the lifestyle modification, lifestyle choices, and the right choices made very early in that first decade itself? Next slide. So in the next slide, what I'm going to be able to tell you is that it continues to be plastic. Even in the adolescent and the adult brain, and this is, of course, studies that are done in rodents, learning, swimming, running, enriching your environment has profound influence on the birth of neurons in the brain and their survival. And what you can see is just the control compared to the learners, swimmers, runners in the first panel, A, B, C, D, E. You can see many more stem cells dividing and way more plasticity. So what I want to convey is that interventional strategies are diverse. They don't always have to be pharmacological. Often, lifestyle interventional strategies will also have, at least at the milder end of the spectrum, profound effects, and they can really rewire the nervous system. And the last slide that I want to show you is the aging brain. And I, again, don't need to tell this audience that estrogen is profoundly protective. And then as the system loses, the fact that you lose estrogen with reproductive senescence and with menopause, you lose some of the protective effects of estrogen. And that has profound effects in terms of risk for stroke, risk for cardiovascular dysfunction. And so there's not a point of time in your life where hormones, environment don't have a profound effect on the brain. And also what you choose to do in your environment. So I think the interesting question will be not simply pharmacological and clinical interventions, but behavioral interventions and bringing in behavioral partners who can really modify lifestyle early. All that we do from our research tells us that the early window matters. Go in and change behavioral patterns early. The later you wait, the harder it is to change set behavioral patterns. So that's what I have to say. We've done all this, of course, not just my work, but work from collaborators and colleagues all over the world that strongly indicates that the brain is a very plastic organ. And for multiple disorders, including PCOS, it will be critical to capitalize on the plasticity of this organ using a variety of combinatorial strategies. Of course, the pharmacological and clinical, but combine it with the interventional strategies of behavior, because that can have profound long-term behavioral effects. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you so much, Vidita. That was brilliant, absolutely. I'll now bring in Anuja, and then we'll start with our discussion. So, Anuja, let me first of all introduce her very informally, a dear friend whom I know for the last more than a decade. And she is a Mumbai girl, just as Vidita is a Mumbai girl. Anuja comes from KM Hospital, and I don't know which year you graduated, but you got a scholarship, a Rhodes Scholarship, and you went to Oxford, and you got your PhD there, and you got your PhD in the field of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. And today, this is way back, I think in 92?
Right.
92, 93?
That's right.
And way back. And then today we are using a lot of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for our patients, where actually research goes into clinical practice, as Vidita already told us. It's 10, 15 years ahead, and this is what happened 20 years ago, probably. So now you went to London for your PhD, and from London you moved to the US, and you went to Yale University. You did your post-graduation, got your board certified, and got board certified in obstetrics and gynecology. And you have been very much interested in the field of reproductive endocrinology. And you have also headed the Androgen Excess and PCOS Society of PCOS, AE-PCOS, that's what I mean. You've been the president, and now you're the associate executive director. I have worked with Dr. Usha Krishna when she was president of Foxy, and I'm very close to her, and she was the one who introduced you to me. You were also very close to her. So tell me about some of your experiences whilst you were at the KM Hospital.
Oh, while I was at KM?
Yes.
Oh, so many memories and so many fun memories. And actually, I had the pleasure of going back. Well, this year was the pandemic. So last year, in the beginning of last year, when I had visited Mumbai, and the endocrinology division there, or department there, invited me to speak. And it was just so nice to go back and walk through all the halls and sort of see the tennis courts, library, just great memories. But, you know, I think what is really relevant for this audience to know, because I know there are, the younger generation is attending this panel today, is even at that time, Dr. Usha Krishna was my mentor and really encouraged me to do research, which was really not that common for medical students. And we did a project looking at the HSG findings in women and the accuracy when it was followed up by laparoscopy and the true positive and the true negative values. And that was my introduction to a research project, and that we were able to take to completion and publish, which is also important,
Yeah.
seeing something from the beginning to the end. So lots of fun clinical memories, great friends, but I think even more relevant to today's symposia or discussion is starting off asking questions that you don't have answers to, or people take some of these answers for granted and there may not be data for that. And there is no harm in reinvestigating, and hence the word researching some of these questions. So really, I'm grateful to her for my introduction to research methodologies.
Yeah. But just now you are such a busy clinician, you still get time to do clinical research. So how do you manage that? How do you get it funded? How do you take the time to write it or to research it? There's so much involved in doing clinical research.
Yeah. No, I think that's the role of an academic clinician or physician is we try to wear both those hats of doing the research, either basic science or clinical. And most of my work now, even though my PhD was a basic science PhD and I had a lab initially, I closed down the lab and now I primarily do translational and clinical research. And then I see patients. I run a huge program for PCOS, which is multidisciplinary. We are at 2 locations. And that's important because, the questions come from the patients. And once you have the answers, you're taking it back to the patient. So you can't isolate these 2 things. You really need to keep them in parallel. So it's all exciting and I like it. So I keep balancing the 2.
Yeah. And with 2 children now who have gone to university, I mean, in the US, it's not easy to run a family, to look after a family, do your academics, do your clinical work, etc., etc. It's very tough. I think in India, we are luckier. We have enough domestic help at home. We have probably joint families where family members pitch in. So I think it's easier probably for us to find a little time. And still we find that not many of us are doing clinical research. To be honest with you, yes, I worked with Dr. Ajit Mehta, and sorry, unfortunately, he's no more, but he was the one who, sort of drilled research into my head. And therefore, it interests me also to do some kind of research.
Yeah.
So, Anu, tell me, Anuja. You were
I
saying
was
something.
just going to follow up on the last thing that you're very true. It takes a village. None of us can do any of these things alone, and you have to give credit where credit is due. So I truly owe it to my parents. My mom came here, helped raise the kids, and was there, as a backbone while I was doing my fellowship training and trying to do a lot of stuff at work. And again, at work, you have wonderful colleagues. Your nurses are the ones who help take care of the patients. Your research coordinators are the ones who help with the research ideas. So it takes a village. None of us are doing this alone. And at each stage, I think my advice would be never say no to the help. Take it. If somebody wants to be a partner and help you, take it. And it's better to distribute the credit and move science forward and move the care forward rather than struggling alone.
Absolutely. So tell us about your work on mental health. What all have you seen? Because you've been running a PCOS clinic, you see a lot of it. So tell us about your work, your publications. Let us know overall what all, and then we'll go on with the discussions.
Right. So what I'd like to share is the story as to how I got involved with this, because there aren't very many reproductive endocrinologists who are interested in the field of psychiatry. And so the way I stumbled upon it, it really wasn't my primary area of interest. My interest in PCOS was cardiometabolic risk. And we had started looking at metabolic syndrome in young women with PCOS. And then having found a high prevalence, so this is about 20 years ago, then we were asking the question, what is the effect of metabolic syndrome? What is happening to the endothelial function? And those were the translational studies I was doing with collaborators in cardiology. And at that time, I had a medical student who was on our rotation and was really interested in research. And there were a few publications describing depression in women with PCOS, but really more like case series and reports and nothing more rigorous. And so, as part of her research project, we decided to ask the question, do women with PCOS really have a higher risk of depression? And we identified the screening tools and decided that the right populations, if it was going to be our PCOS center, then the control population needed to be young women coming into the hospital, not in a different area, and maybe coming for their regular GYN exam, right? For their annual exam, pap smear, controlling for BMI. So really rigorously trying to ask the question. And so she completed this phenomenal study with over about 100 patients in each group, wrote up an abstract which was accepted at, in the US, it's the American Society for Reproductive Medicine. So this is about 16 years ago now. And as a fourth year medical student, she won the first prize for this. And that was the beginning of her journey and my journey to sort of explore psychiatric disorders and PCOS. And even at that time, I remember when I presented her work at the AE-PCOS Society, the introduction was, oh, this is the first time we are hearing an OBGYN talk about psychiatry. So, people did not take it as seriously because it's a new field. And when you start new, there isn't enough data to support it. And people aren't sure if you're the expert in this field, you're coming in from a different area. But again, it's that value of collaboration over time. We've collaborated with others. We brought in psychiatrists and psychologists to really understand what if our findings were true and the relevance of these findings. And then as you'll hear through the rest of this conversation, there's robust data now to support psychiatric comorbidities. But I wanted to share that initial story because, again, you could be much junior as a medical student during fellowship, get interested, ask the questions, and you have no idea where some of these things might take you.
Absolutely. And that is why I think our young people should learn how to think for themselves, think of why something is happening, what we need to do for it, etc., etc. And of course, with mentors like you and Vidita around, I think they do benefit a lot from it. So I think we'll go on with our discussion with, we would like to have Vidita join us and we could then take the discussion further. So my first question is to Vidita. That Vidita, when you're doing your lab work, and I know you've worked with rats, right? So you worked with rats to determine what kind of changes occur with stress. So first of all, to clarify, we talk about anxiety, we talk about depression, we talk about stress, and they're all sort of correlated with each other. How would you define the difference between anxiety and depression?
So the circuits for anxiety and depression are different. The requirement for depression is a state of depressed mood. That's the essential core requirement as a diagnosis for depression, right? And all of us feel depressed, but that's not clinical depression. I mean, we will all go through states in which we have perhaps felt low for a few days or not felt really okay. But to be actually diagnosed, you have to meet DSM criteria of what is depression for a sustained period of time. And that's a series of criteria. But one of the central criteria that is absolutely essential is a depressed mood state. That's quite distinct from anxiety. And by the way, anxiety and depression are very highly comorbid disorders. So the likelihood of them coexisting is quite substantial. But it's not a given that they always coexist.
Correct.
Anxiety, on the other hand, and both, by the way, are at higher rates in women. So there is a component of that as well, that both anxiety and depression are found at higher numbers in women. And that itself is interesting to consider and think about. Anxiety would be defined as a state in which there is a sustained, almost like a fear stress response to a cue that would sometimes be considered positively innocuous. Just a regular cue, but it's provoking a full-fledged response. And the most severe state of that is a state of panic, in which it almost can feel like the individual is literally having a cardiac arrest, because they're manifesting with almost all the symptoms of chest pain and palpitations and all of that. So anxiety disorder, comorbid disorders, but distinct as well. And when you study them in terms of circuits in the brain, they are again overlapping but also distinct. So there's the possibility that it's a little murky because it's not such a clear-cut line of separation, but the circuits are overlapping but yet distinct. I hope that helps. And
Yeah,
stress
but
is
how do you diagnose anxiety and depression in rats?
so you can't. So you shouldn't even attempt to. I mean, that's the serious reality that you have to say, that you're not going to have an anxious rat or a depressed rat. What you're going to have, what you're going to have is endophenotypes that respond to drugs that treat anxiety and depression. And you can use animal models in which you do a behavioral task in which an animal which has undergone high degree of stress will exhibit behavioral changes that, for example, could be change in risk-taking behavior, change in sort of pleasure seeking for a pleasurable stimulus. And most of these behavioral paradigms respond to drugs. So, for example, a drug like Valium or Librium, which is given, any benzodiazepine that is used to treat anxiety, will also work as effectively in rodent models when you're studying such kind of behaviors. So you run them on a battery of behavioral tasks, not one, but several. And that's just a measure of the behavior. But it's wrong to call them anxious or depressed. That would be really problematic.
So the question, because you're working on rats and you're trying to, study their emotional status, and you're trying to understand their neurocircuitry, etc., etc. So, you mentioned that there are structural, molecular, and epigenetic changes which occur. So, what kind of changes do you look for in the brain structurally to assess that, yes, this is a brain which has been sort of affected by depression?
So I'll give you one very obvious example, one which has been studied extensively in the field. So one of the things that we know clinically is individuals who suffer from severe recurrent major depression and are refractory very often to treatment show volumetric decline of a structure in the brain called the hippocampus. It actually shrinks in volume. And this is work done from multiple colleagues at Yale. And beautiful, elegant work, and it's been replicated by many groups around the world. When you do the same sort of stressors in animal models, you see atrophy and death and loss of hippocampal neurons. So what you see at a volumetric change in the clinical situation in imaging studies is manifested as cell dendritic atrophy. So neurons actually shrink their arbors, and many of them actually will even wall up and die. So you will have cell death. Turnover of stem cells in the hippocampus goes down. And these are the obvious sort of structural changes. And underlying this are changes in trophic factors or growth factors that keep neurons, in a sense, healthy. And you see a profound decline in these growth factors. And often that's seen for a very long duration of time, depending on when the stress was, the severity of stress, and the nature of stress. So this would be an example of the kind of structural change you see in the brain.
Yeah. And of course, you do have your molecular changes and your epigenetic changes. So this is something what we do on the lab side to find out what are the changes occurring. We obviously can't do that in humans. So Anuja, are you doing any kind of testing in these patients where you found a problem with depression or anxiety in PCO patients? Are there any known changes tests which we do besides, getting the mental health questionnaires filled? Or is there any other way we can assess that whether they are having some structural changes?
Yeah. So just to share with the audience, the first step, though, what we do for the screening is there are very standardized questionnaires that are present. And those, as Dr. Vidita said clearly, they're screening tools. So they give you that first level of if they are at a higher risk for depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms. Those don't necessarily make that clinical diagnosis. And then the clinical diagnosis, there are very well-defined criteria now with DSM-5 that, you have to meet certain criteria and for a certain duration of time, because then that gives you sort of the definitions of MDD, which is major depressive disorder, or then there is MDD and NOS, which is not well, defined. And similarly in anxiety. So then the clinical diagnosis is established. And it's not that often that the psychiatrist would then go to another level of imaging. There are functional MRIs where one can look for changes and differences, but they're mainly used in research settings if you're asking a certain question. and then see what area lights up to understand the activity in those areas, but not that those are used clinically. Primarily because I don't think there's relevance in terms of, how would you use it clinically? And so it's more a research tool. So right now it's more, the screening is by questionnaires for making a diagnosis, followed by an interview to really go over those answers and make sure that you're not over-diagnosing people.
Yeah. So stress is known to cause depression, any kind of stress. Like in your paper, Vidita, you have talked about separation of the rats from their mothers, right? So when you did that experiment, what were you trying to show? And did you have controls to show the difference between the two?
Right. So this is a classical old model. It's a model that's been used since the 1950s, was set up by Seymour Levine and others at University of Colorado in Boulder and Denver. And it matters. You're trying to find a model for early life stress. And the main stimulus that the baby rat or the baby mouse has is its mother. And this is not a biparental system. So let me make sure that that's very clear. In biparental system, even paternal separation can have an effect, because then it fragments the quality of care. But in the case of the laboratory mice and the laboratory rats, it's only the dam, it's only the mother. So you take the pups away from the mother for 3 hours a day, and that's actually a very small duration perturbation. They're not nutritionally deprived or anything. But what happens is it fragments the quality of care she gives when they come back. So it's a model, in a sense, for fragmented maternal care. And that's the sort of situation that one can imagine in multiple contexts where fragmented care may happen, even in the human context. Except that there it's much more complex because there are multiple caregivers. It's rarely just the mother. There are many, many players who are providing care to the infant. So the idea is you do this perturbation and then you look across the lifespan, whether they are behavioral, molecular, cellular, architectural changes. And of course, you have animals where you don't do any separation. So you'll have a control cohort, which is just raised normally. And even with our separation, they're given back to the mums immediately within 3 hours. And then after the separation period is over, which is 3 hours daily for the first 2 weeks of life, then you leave them undisturbed. So you're not really changing anything after that. But the effects are fairly long lasting and profound. And I want to say that the timing of stress matters, because when you come in with stressors in adulthood, they do have effects, but very often they're transient. They wash off. But when you come in with a stressor in the early developmental window, the effects are sometimes lifelong. And so there, it is not just that the stress will always have an effect. It's the severity of the stress. It's the timing of the stress. And it's really critical to think about the context. It's very important to think about this because you can override this. For example, if you take the pups and you adopt them to another mother, and she's a good caregiver, you won't see any of the effects. So you can override it. So there are plenty of contexts in which it can be easily overridden as well. And that's something we are fascinated by, that if you have stress, how do you recover from it? What's the resilience that you can demonstrate? And resilience is profound as well. As much as this vulnerability, the other side of that coin is resilience. And that's equally interesting to study.
Yeah. So the clinical side, Anuja, have you found any such stressors which in these patients have, probably, I'm not saying definitely, but probably cause them to go into this, disturbed or dysfunctional mental health situation?
Yeah, and that's a good question. So again, to re-emphasize, the way we use the word stress colloquially is not what we are referring to here. So I could have had a stressful day at work yesterday because I had a lot of surgeries. That's not what we are talking about. We are really talking about a prolonged period of stress. And the way that is assessed in the adult human model is there are screens that look at adverse childhood experiences, the ACE kind of screen. And again, that's what Dr. Vidita is talking about, is the childhood stress period. It's really not episodic stress when you're an adult, which may come and go, versus these prolonged periods. And there are very few studies that have looked at that with respect to PCOS. The one study that comes to mind is from Australia, where they have a population-based study longitudinally following women. And as part of all the different questionnaires, they have data on the ACE questionnaire as well, and showing a little bit of link, but really the link was like more with obesity. And then when you control for obesity, then PCOS doesn't stand out as an independent association. So I'm not sure we really have any robust data, and it may just be that enough studies haven't looked at it. I don't even know if it's a relatively new concept in the human model, or Vidita, you could share with us. It just hasn't been done as much in the PCOS field, but I definitely know one study that's looked at it.
Yeah. But maybe in children, if there has been some very early stress whilst they were children, like say, for example, in the animal model, the rat is separated from the mother within, immediately after birth. So in the human being, in humans, when babies are separated from their mothers, or when children are undergoing some stress for whatever reason, could it cause enough harm to them, which can cause other disorders, like as they grow, eating disorders, or just eating a lot and putting on weight, or having any other, like anorexia, anything? Can it cause such situations? Because these would be stress factors. I'm giving an example because just recently, just a day back, I spoke on sexual abuse. We know that young people get sexually abused, little children get sexually abused at, with help at home, with whatever. So question is that would that kind of a stress in a child cause enough harm to them to come up with manifestations such as depression or anxiety or eating disorders or whatever? So if anyone can help me with that, I'll be
I think that correlation, there is data, and hence, there are these screens which look at adverse childhood experiences, and they could be anything. It may not be separation, it could be abuse, like you're talking about. And those could have a profound effect on mental health later. The question was, does it sort of tie in with PCOS? And we don't know that part.
That we don't know, right?
Yeah, but with a mental health consequence, yes, I think there are enough data to suggest that, and hence, doing these screens so you know what to target in terms of therapies and how to address some of these issues is to get to the bottom of it as to what might link up to the manifestations we see in adulthood.
Yeah. So when it comes to, you spoke, Vidita, about neuroplasticity of the brain. And, it seems to be very high, at the level of the adolescent. So I've read that with adolescents, they multitask. They're listening to music, they are listening to the parent, and the parent is yelling that I'm telling you to do this, and I'm listening, I'm doing it, etc. They multitask and they do it brilliantly. So is it because of their brain going through that phase of neuroplasticity, or what exactly is it which allows them to do that kind of job?
There's no question that, for example, let's say you want to learn a new musical instrument. That's a genuine challenge, okay? For us to learn a new musical instrument, it's a substantial challenge. On a new language, you learn a new language much easier when you're younger. You'll be able to pick up a new musical instrument much easier when you're younger. There's no question about it. It's much harder as a full-fledged, 30-year-old or 40-year-old to say, now I'm going to start playing the violin, or I'm going to suddenly learn Spanish or Tamil or whatever. It's not going to be easy. The level of demand will be significantly higher. So there's no question that the brain is plastic and able to acquire novel learning much more easily in the earlier window. But I also want to caution against thinking that everything is easier in the earlier window, for the following reason: that the prefrontal cortex, which is the circuit that's expanded the most in evolution and is substantially larger in humans than it is in many other mammalian species, that doesn't fully functionally mature until you're in your early 20s. And the prefrontal cortex is a critical circuit because it provides top-down control over stress responses. It's the circuit that you want to have good control to manage impulsive behavior, risk-taking behavior. And that's one of the reasons why in adolescence you will also see examples of risk-taking and impulsivity, which might be at a way higher level than what you would see in a full-fledged adult. And so it's the two sides of the coin. Yes, it's a more plastic circuit, but it's also a circuit that hasn't yet fully reached maturity in certain parts of the cortex. And that's why sometimes choice and decision making may be inappropriate in that window.
So what age do you think they should make those important decisions?
Well, I mean, if you're purely going to, so this is a very interesting question. I was reading a very wonderful book by Robert Sapolsky called Behave, and in which he decides that, defines the idea of adulthood. Legally, we say you're an adult at 18. You're ready to vote. But what happens on like this last night of your 17th year? Nothing is dramatically going to change when you hit 18. It's not like all these synapses are closing out and suddenly your brain has become adult. It's just that we notionally chose that year as sort of legal adulthood. But if you're saying based on neuroscience, there's a continuum and there's individual variability there as well. But circuits really, especially prefrontal cortical circuits, it's the early 20s, by which time you see full-fledged maturation of those circuits. So if you're going to go by a neuroscience definition, it's really the early 20s when it starts actually getting to the point where you can say you're looking at a fairly mature brain.
Right. Okay, so now I think we have understood the pathophysiology of why all these changes occur with mental health. Let's go to the to the management of these patients. Like say when Anuja, when you see a patient and you made a diagnosis that this girl or boy, whoever, has got a mental health issue in terms of depression. I mean, how would you go about managing these patients?
Yeah, and so really my experience is only with the girls and women, not the boys.
Yeah, sure.
and my experience is also really in a narrower field of fertility, PCOS. And as part of our multidisciplinary program, I think the first thing that I would say is make a diagnosis. That's where we make the biggest mistake is we miss that out. We're so busy talking about everything else when we see our fertility patients or the PCOS patients. That's sort of the mental health questions, and the screening becomes the last thing, or we never get to it because there isn't enough time in the appointment and you're ready to see your next patient. So the first message I would give is don't forget that because the prevalence is high. So the background prevalence of depression is about 10 to 12%, at least in the West, for women in reproductive age. And so that's a large chunk of the population. And if you say with PCOS, especially, there's a 2 or 3-fold increased risk, that's very high. And so you really need to make sure you're screening the population. Now, the risk may be different in India and the background rate might be different, but that's fine. Even so, if there's a doubling, that's a big deal. And you do not want to miss these patients. Anxiety is even higher. The prevalence of anxiety, as you heard, in women is higher. And in general, the prevalence of anxiety is higher than depression. So you're going to pick that up even more so. So the first step would be make a diagnosis, do the screening, and you may even just pick up symptoms, not the actual full-form disorder. And that's okay because it's a continuum. And addressing why the symptoms are present, are they linked to either what you're seeing the patient for? So in my case, the large group, with PCOS, to try and say, what is it linked to? And the confounders can be weight, body image, if there's hyperandrogenism, so hair growth, acne, some of that links into body image. And then there are some studies in our field that are now showing genetic links. So when you do the GWAS studies, which are genome-wide association studies, they have shown biological similarity between the genes for depression and PCOS going sort of tracking together. So there may be some real sort of background risk that exists in addition to environmental based on weight or appearance. So both of those. So again, before we jump to how are you treating, you want to try and understand, do they have it? Is it symptoms or the actual disorder? What are the factors that are worsening this? Because you might want to correct the factors then that are associated with it. So managing the weight and the challenges with weight, or managing the body appearance. And it's not always, like Dr. Duru said in the beginning, a question of beautifying. It's more a question of helping the patient modify their response to their own weight or how their body looks, right? Because there's a spectrum. And it's very interesting. We have a scale which is known as the Stunkard body image scale, and there are images of women from, for example, a size 0 to a size 10. And you ask the patient, what size do you think you are on this? And there's a tendency always to think you are much bigger than you are. So that's a perception, right? That you perceive yourself as not being in the norm and outside the norm. And then that can link into how you feel in terms of either anxious about your body or just depressed about it too. So our role is more to try and understand what are the associations, and if they really need medications, then I enlist the help of the psychiatrist who works with us. And if they need more therapy, then we have a psychologist as well as part of the program. So it's not always that we are rushing to any of those pharmacological treatments versus just addressing some of these issues initially. It's a young population that I typically see.
Correct. But is there any role for genetics in this? I mean, do you find that a family where the mother is having a state of depression and even the daughter tends to have a higher risk of developing it? Just like in PCOS, we have not really found enough of genetic, sort of, it's not enough what we thought earlier that it's more heritable. But now, even with this, is there any heritability?
Yeah, absolutely. So with depression, it has been shown, and there are studies that show a higher risk if you have other family members who have been diagnosed with depression, then the next generation will be at a high risk. There's no single gene that has been identified. So it doesn't follow like a Mendelian autosomal recessive or dominant kind of trait, but it's sort of a complex condition, like a little bit like diabetes, right? There are risk factors, environmental as well as genetic, that predispose. So very important to take a family history as well, because if there is a family history of depression, then there is going to be a predisposition genetically that's going to drive the higher risk in your patient.
So probably when we are doing the history taking, we need to keep in mind that we need to take the family history. We need to look at her background, her past background, and try to probably analyze with the help of a psychologist, I think, to go more into details of what is the cause of her state of mind. And I mean, you must be seeing a lot of patients having eating disorders too. So
Right.
how do you handle that situation?
So that's a sort of relatively new field that we have been recognizing in association with PCOS. So adolescents do tend to have a slightly higher prevalence of eating disorders than adults, but really we have an adult population of PCOS as well that has shown a higher rate compared to the background rates. And it's not the anorexia nervosa as much that we see as much as bulimia and eating disorders and binge eating disorders. So again, with eating disorders, there's like a questionnaire and a screen, and you could have what's called disordered eating patterns. So you don't have the whole formal diagnosis, or you could have a formal diagnosis. So everywhere there's a continuum. It's not like black and white. And it's important to recognize your patients who even have this initial disordered eating patterns, because that could eventually lead to an eating disorder. It's really important in PCOS because, the first line of treatment for PCOS is lifestyle modification, and we are always talking about weight management. And so now you get into this cyclic bind, because patients with eating disorders don't do well when you make recommendations about changes in the diet. And very stringent recommendations can drive somebody to have an eating disorder, a little bit like the patient Dr. Duru explained in the very beginning, right? Because she was doing this very strict diet, and then we get into the cycle of restrictive eating. So for us, when our nutritionist sits and makes recommendations about dietary changes and weight management, it's important for the nutritionist to know, does the patient have an underlying eating disorder? Does the patient have underlying emotional eating related to anxiety? Some patients are very anxious and their response to anxiety is they binge eat. Or do they have depression and hence then their response to eating is different, or they don't engage in lifestyle changes and exercise? Because if you have an underlying depressive mood, you're not going to exercise as much and do the activities that are recommended. So all of this ties in a lot in management of the patient and trying to understand which one they have or don't have will change how you make the next step of recommendations.
Absolutely. So when Vidita, I wanted to ask you, like, say, if a person has been found to be depressed, and we know that even long-term use of steroids can cause a stress situation, which could that also lead to depression?
I mean, certainly, if you're exposed to very high levels of cortisone for a long period of time, it does impact the very circuits that also modulate mood, and it can disrupt mood, but it doesn't always necessarily manifest as full-fledged major depression. But certainly, that's something that one has to keep in mind, which is sustained exposure to corticosteroids would have that sort of an effect on circuits. In fact, one of the animal models of depression is to put animals on corticosterone in the drinking water. So that's a
Right.
standard model that people use. But keep in mind that only 50% of depressed patients show sort of a dexamethasone suppression test or a dysfunction, overt and obvious dysfunction of the HPA axis. It's certainly a subcomponent of patients, but it's not all patients. So it
Yeah,
could
sure.
manifest, but it might not necessarily.
It might not necessarily. But suppose a woman, I mean, a girl has multiple episodes of depression, and we put them on SSRIs or any of the antidepressants. Does it really help in improving the neurocircuitry mechanism? How does it work?
Yeah. So, I mean, the primary target is well understood. For most of these drugs, which are SSRIs, they're hitting the reuptake mechanism of the neurotransmitter. So, they will, by blocking the reuptake transporters, they will elevate serotonin if it's an SSRI, if it's an SNRI, serotonin and norepinephrine. So, that covers a large class of antidepressants. So, they're essentially resulting in the brain seeing more serotonin. Now, the problem is that, and the complexity of it is that serotonin has something like 14 receptors. Okay. And they're present in all these circuits. And some of those circuits actually, an SSRI would increase anxiety. And this is a common side effect of an SSRI in the acute phase of SSRI administration. So let's say you have a depressed patient, you get them started on an SSRI. One of the things that would be commonly seen as a unexpected, but something that is seen routinely, is in the acute phase of SSRI starting, you may actually get an anxiety like state. You may enhance and worsen anxiety. And SSRIs take a while to kick in and work, anywhere from 3 to 6 weeks. So while they do work and we have an immediate target, we still don't know how they architecturally and functionally change the human brain. We have hypotheses, lots of working hypotheses, but this is a syndromal illness, and we all put it underneath the one catch-all phrase of depression. And so that's the key part, right? Because we're talking about really syndromal illnesses that are now being binned together as depression or binned together as anxiety and then comorbid conditions. And while we understand acute targets, mechanistically, we cannot tell you which specific circuit has been normalized to reverse the behavior back to normal. And many of these disorders have relapse, high rate of relapse. So even though you have recovery, unless you do have a fundamental change in the challenging circumstances or the underlying pathology, it's a matter of time sometimes before it manifests again.
Right. So therefore, probably cognitive behavioral therapy would probably more long-term effective, and that is something which I think quite a few of our patients would require to come out of this dysfunction which they have. But just on a little casual note, what number of circuitries are known in the brain as of now?
Lots of circuits are known. Lots of circuits are known.
About how many?
Oh gosh. I mean, you have, I can't even give you a number. For example, there's a circuit that's responsible for yawning. There will be basic circuits that are known for things like a yawn. But fear circuitry is well identified. Circuits that are associated with displeasure, circuits for fear, circuits for, obviously the hypothalamic circuitry is well studied for hormonal response modulation.
That's true.
The tricky part is to see the interconnectedness across these different circuits. And that's quite substantial. So once you realize you're dealing with trillions of neurons and trillions of synapses, it's an electrical engineer's nightmare to put all these circuits together in the human. It's already hard in a rodent, and rodents have far less neurons than humans do. So
Yeah. Okay. So coming to the effects of various therapies, like say there have been many patients who have been put on antidepressants, and they have been followed up. They go through a phase when they are fine. You have to wean them off the antidepressants over a period of time. You can't suddenly stop. And then once they are off, and then suddenly comes a phase when I think Anuja has worked on this, on postpartum psychosis or postpartum problems or mental dysfunction or depression, which they have come. You have studied a large number. Your paper has covered that, Anuja.
Yeah,
Postpartum
I can talk about
depression.
that. So we sort of went in sequence. We started off looking at depression, and then, of course, because of its comorbid, we were looking at anxiety. Then we looked at it whether it's longitudinal. Are we just seeing it in the 20-year-old, or as we go 30s, 40s, 50s, what happens?
Hmm.
And then got interested in eating disorder, and then we looked at body image more to understand what is mediating anxiety and depression. But the one very big group which is relevant and that was brought up right now is what happens in pregnancy. And there's a lot of data on perinatal or peripartum depression and postpartum depression. Women who have a history of depression are at a higher risk of postpartum depression. Women who have postpartum depression can have a lot of other complications related to taking care of the newborn child and themselves. So, this is an important women's health issue. And there was very little data on PCOS and depression in pregnancy and postpartum depression. And in order to sort of try to get that answer in a large cohort, because you really want the power in your study through the numbers to give you a significant difference, right? Because now we're looking at women who have PCOS, have become pregnant postpartum, and then need to get postpartum depression to find out the difference between our groups. So what we did was we used a large administrative data set, so through insurance companies, and insurance companies follow, their patients, and they have a lot of data through the ICD codes as to if they were pregnant, did they have diabetes in pregnancy, hypertension, so we could get all those comorbidities. And then we looked at those who had depression in the postpartum period. So we had about 42,000 women with PCOS in this cohort and several more controls. And then we chose just that population that had a pregnancy, a population that had also 6 months before pregnancy, because we wanted to make sure they had or did not have depression before they were pregnant, because as you heard, depression increases your risk. So we needed the longitudinal follow-up prior to pregnancy and then 1 year postpartum, because the definition of postpartum depression varies depending on which medical society you follow. So there's a 6 month, a 3 month, a 1 year definition, and we wanted to make sure we covered all of that. And so when we asked that question, women with PCOS controlling for other comorbidities and risk factors had an increased risk of prenatal or antenatal. During pregnancy, they had an increased risk of depression and they had an increased risk of postpartum depression. So that I think ties in nicely with this story that has developed, that this group is a high risk group. Now, of course, to remind you, my main interest was initially in cardiovascular risks.
Yes.
Cohort, we looked at depression, we looked at gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and postpartum. We also looked at postpartum stroke, DVTs, and some of peripartum cardiomyopathy. So this was very powerful that this data set, because of the large numbers, was able to give us differences between the two groups, even though the prevalence may be low, right? Because postpartum cardiomyopathy is so rare, but when you have such large numbers, you can really query the data sets and look at all the
Yeah.
data.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was a
Yeah.
phenomenal study. And actually, what I'd like to share with this audience is this study, the first author was our fellow in reproductive endocrinology, and she did it as part of her master's thesis. And last year, 2019, her paper as well won the first prize at ASRM. So we've had a record now of two of our mentees doing very well in this space and doing research and very different kinds of research. But again, examples just to share with the audience that these studies do not have to be with lead investigators as first authors. Our students can do extremely well asking these questions and, publishing their results.
I think that was really excellent, because we do actually in India, we don't see a lot of postpartum mental depression, because I think most of our women do have a big joint family, or they have people around them, and they are not sort of really, getting stressed with the fact that they have to deal with the baby and deal with everything together. But here you have brought out the fact that PCO patients are at a higher risk of developing depression postpartum. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. They also have a risk of having depression during premenstrual phase, or during, there are people who have premenstrual depression, and those are the women who we find have got a higher risk of developing postpartum depression. So I don't know whether that connection has been made, whether women who have premenstrual depression also are at a higher risk of postpartum, because these are the mood changes which occur in women. Mood changes may be where either they get premenstrually, they get very violent, or they may become so quiet that they go and sneak into their room and don't talk to anybody. So you get different kinds of mood changes. But is there any connection between the two?
Right. So, the PPMD is in the luteal phase mental dysphoria. So I'm trying to remember, premenstrual PPMD, menstrual dysphoria is what you're talking about. And
yes.
So the typical description there is in that 7 days prior to the period, when women will complain of the depressive symptoms and a range of symptoms. And very typically then the period comes on and they're much better. And the first 2 weeks of the follicular phase, they feel much better. And it's even been shown that if you give SSRIs just for that 7-day window, you can treat it in some of the cases, and just very targeted. And it may be related to some of the progesterone agents that are released at that time. It's very hard to look at PPMD in PCOS because they don't have regular menses, right? So in all our studies for depression, when we screen them, that doesn't come up as a risk factor at all, because they are not cycling as regular, right?
But there may be patients who are not cycling, who get regular periods, and probably if you look at that subset who have regular periods, maybe you may find some. So maybe you don't have enough numbers there.
So you bring up
a powered study.
One of the gaps in knowledge with PCOS is, with respect to depression, is the phenotypes. So this is what Dr. Duru is referring to. In PCOS, we have different phenotypes. So there's the hyperandrogenic phenotype that has the high male hormone levels, but there is that phenotype that may have only irregular periods and the PCO-looking ovaries, and their androgens are relatively normal. We know they don't have a high risk of metabolic syndrome. So our group and others have done a number of those studies that their cardiometabolic risk is low, but we really don't have data on that phenotype with respect to depression and anxiety. And that comes more from are the androgens driving it. Now, the question you're asking, Duru, is different. If they have regular menses, then the phenotype is going to be C, which is high androgens and PCO-looking ovaries. And that's the least prevalent. It's like less than 10%. So we may not have enough numbers, but
that's what I'm saying.
Question that you're asking. In that particular group, what is the correlation?
Yeah. So that's what I thought, that probably the numbers are small. And that is why you cannot have a powered study over there. You may not find statistical significance.
Yeah.
So, Vidita, we have recently come across data with babies who are in utero, and where the mothers are hyperandrogenic. They have high androgen levels, or they may be having high insulin levels, and those babies are at a higher risk of developing PCOS. So that kind of data has really come in very heavily now. There's a lot of data available. What I'm coming to is that, in India, most of the pregnant mothers are told that you must listen to, good, bhajans during pregnancy. You must think of positive thoughts. You must not be, depressed. There are a whole lot of advice given by everyone around you. And those days we used to feel, come on, how can it affect the baby? But now, honestly, I keep thinking that probably these positive thoughts, these positive, hymns, or, not hymns really, but mantras which you give to the child whilst the baby is in utero, would it, you think, I mean, this is just a thought, would it affect the baby?
I mean, the baby can hear by the 5, 6 month stage. So, I mean, if you're going to be playing really loud, cacophonous music, the baby is going to be sensitive to that. So, that's for sure. I mean, disruption of its environment is also a reality. And there's no question that the baby is eating whatever the mother's eating. So, I mean, and if your mother is, secreting high levels of cortisol, not cortisol. Not yeah. So I will say cortisone because I'm a rat mouse person, but cortisol. So you have high levels of cortisol floating around in the blood because of sustained stress for the mother. That's crossing the placental barrier and that's directly impacting the baby brain. And in animal models, prenatal stress is a very potent model to have long-term effects on the brain and the circuits in the brain, and often has lifelong effects in the manner in which it manifests in utero and then eventually manifests in the fetus. So I would say that there's no question that managing your stress, and that could be whatever. I mean, there might be some people who will listen to a rock concert and be completely calm. It might be a utterly different cue that people use for, and there will be some people who will be told, please listen to these hymns, and will start getting stressed because they're told repeatedly to listen to the hymns. So the bottom line being, it doesn't matter what the cue is, but if the cue is going to help you manage the stress, then there's no question there can be a profoundly beneficial effect on the fetus, because the data on prenatal stress and gestational stress is quite solid. That indicates that so many of these things cross the placental barrier and they have a profound effect in programming the nervous system. So there might be a lot of truth to some of the grandmother's tales that we talk about, things that our grandmothers told us.
Exactly.
But there's no biological, there's mechanistic biological insight to what sounded like a grandmother's tale.
Yeah, I think that's really those were observations, and today you have evidence. It's something like this. So we have some of our listeners asking questions, and I would like to put their questions across to you. So since we are discussing, not having stress during pregnancy, so they said yoga is said to reduce stress. How much it will help the PCO patients, and which types of yoga is more beneficial? Is any of you a yoga expert? You can answer that question.
I'm going to hand that to Anuja because I cannot make my rats do any yoga, so that I will have no insight to this. This one is in Anuja's direction.
Anuja, anything on this yoga?
So only knowing some of it through reading the literature. No, my personal experience with yoga is I do yoga, but nothing that I know in clinical trials. But I think, again, it depends on what you're trying to study and what is the question you're asking, right? So I think if the question is that you have a group of women who are going to do yoga on a regular basis in order, and that'll help reduce, we know yoga gives you a system in life, right? It'll reduce stress in those ways. Then it could have an impact if that's your endpoint. Are you looking at an improvement in anxiety or depression symptoms? Maybe. I don't know if yoga is really going to decrease male hormone levels or make your periods more regular in PCOS. That's not the data I've really seen. But it depends on what endpoint you're looking for. And if the endpoint is, instead of cognitive behavioral therapy, is that another means of managing the lifestyle modification, it goes into that same bucket, then maybe yoga can definitely be another option that can be out there. And that comes like from the Indian subcontinent, similar to acupuncture coming from China, right? Along the same line.
Yes, absolutely.
There are a lot of questions in the acupuncture in PCOS. And there are studies looking at acupuncture and fertility outcomes and pregnancy outcomes as well. I think what I always say to my patient is, if you don't get stressed out running to your acupuncturist and getting all the needles put in, because there are some patients who feel panicky with all those needles going in their body. That's, I think, counterintuitive. That's not going to help you.
Yeah.
Go for an acupuncture session and lay there, and you actually just sleep the whole hour because you're so relaxed. That's where the merit is going to be, I think.
Yeah.
But it depends on the endpoint you ask. If you ask, does it improve the live birth rate and pregnancy rate after IVF? I don't think the data supports that. Does it cure PCOS? We know the answer is no. But if it is helping some of that intermediary, I think the answer is yes, and it'll be very individual. It's not one size fits all. So some people will do well and some may not.
Yeah,
I mean, I want
absolutely.
to just add in one more thing to that, which is breath control because of the pH sensitive neurons in the brain stem. Breath control, which is what is a central component of yoga, may really be a very profoundly great way to control anxiety related, especially in acute anxiety phase or in the middle of a panic attack. I mean, breath control is really quite phenomenal in terms of what it does to brain rhythms and also in terms of how it can stabilize a transient state of panic or anxiety. So, from that perspective, it will indeed be quite interesting as well.
Okay. So basically, the answer to this question is that whatever is causing the stress, we really are not able to control that. But by relieving that stress through any other means which de-stresses you may help in that context. So there is another question wherein where there's a Ranjit Singh who's asking how to cope with depression if you're trapped situationally in life and career. It doesn't really come. Yes,
That's
go
a
ahead.
very tough one. No, that's a tough one because this is something that people. So, what an SSRI will do will give you elevated levels of serotonin, which will facilitate plasticity and adaptive plasticity in the brain. But it can't change your circumstances. It can just give you this milieu in the brain that helps you to sort of exhibit structural adaptive plasticity. And that's the tricky one. If the situation is so challenging that even despite elevating serotonin levels and doing cognitive behavior therapy, you'll have to find either ability to get a grip on the situation, perceive it fundamentally differently. I mean, in the absence of that, it's a massive precipitating factor, even with the treatment. You can do the treatment, but you need to be able to change the perspective. And that's what CBT is trying to do, fundamentally
Absolutely.
teach you to look at the stress and the challenge in a slightly different way. Unless you do that, the drugs they're a crutch, but they're not going to help change the entire landscape. That's what's absolutely essential as well.
I think it's important that the response to the stress is something which you need to master as to how you respond to that stress, and that is something which will come with CBT, I think, that is a long-term therapy, real long-term. So the other question is from Damini, who says, "Does PCOS predispose girls or women to anxiety or depression due to biological differences?" Anuja?
What do you think they mean when they sing?
I think they mean probably because, biologically, women with PCOS may be having these hormonal dysfunction, basically reproductive hormones, like, say, hyperandrogenemia or whatever. So, in those situations, there is some biological difference. So, does that hormonal imbalance probably predispose women, PCOS women, to anxiety and depression?
Right. And so, those are the questions that have been asked to say why are women or adolescents with PCOS at a higher risk for depression or anxiety? And then one of the most common abnormalities that we do find is an elevation in total and free testosterone levels, a little bit in DHEAS. And so usually there are association studies that, look at those associations and then the screens, and there's weak correlations. So it isn't the sole contributing factor and it's not independent, but it's a weak contributor that the hyperandrogenism may be responsible for the higher scores in anxiety, depression. Just as high BMI has been shown to have similar associations as well. High insulin or HOMA-IR, which is insulin resistance, has also shown to have these correlations. And so then, to try and say which one really holds true, what if you are able to normalize that? Does it go away? So if you lose weight, do the scores get better? Or if you do birth control pills and drop the androgens, does it get better? So there are studies that also indicate that it does in some of those treatments, and hence supporting that there is some of this biological association. But it's not just that one thing, and that it alone is not the sole reason why we are finding the increased prevalence.
Okay. So I think there are no more questions from the audience, but if you all would like to give us a sort of a message from both of you to our viewers as to on the clinical side, lab side, what you would recommend to the postgraduates, what would you recommend to clinicians as to how they should take mental health and PCOS together?
Do you want to go first? You want me to go?
Not necessary. It has to be PCOS. You can talk about depression,
yours.
anxiety, whatever.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a couple of messages that I would give. First of all, thank you, Duru, for bringing this fantastic panel together. And it's, as I said, this topic has evolved so much, at least in my field and in my direct clinical experience in these last 2 decades, that it's really nice to see it at the forefront of discussion now. And so a few pearls and lessons, for the younger generation that's on this call. Not to say that we are old. All of us on this panel are pretty young still. but again,
Okay.
be very open-minded. As you do if you have a part of research as part of your career, be open-minded in terms of which way your path goes. We've always heard of, as to have a narrow focus path and keep pursuing that and then do really well, which is great. But the way science is moving is it is interdisciplinary. You're not going to be in a silo. You're not going to work alone. So I collaborate with cardiologists, endocrinologists. I collaborate with psychologists, psychiatrists. And then I collaborate with the kinds of researchers that help with the implementation science, the clinical epidemiology. You really can't do this alone. So be open-minded to asking the questions across fields, not just in your narrow field. Be very willing to collaborate and learn from others, because we don't know it all, and that's fine. And then from our patient perspective, listen to what the patients are saying. They are going to tell us what questions to ask. We are not going to find the questions sitting in our office and reading the journals. When they ask us things that we don't have the answers to, and for sure we don't have the answers to everything, that's what's going to drive the research. Because finally we do research so we can benefit our patients. So the questions will come from our patients. So listen for those as well.
Thank you, Anuja. Vidita?
Yeah, I also want to say a big thank you to Dr. Duru Shah, and who's one of my favorites. I thoroughly enjoy every interaction I have with her. This has been a great opportunity to talk to both of you and to discover that Dr. Anuja and I were at Yale at the same time, and we somehow have not managed to run into each other. But this was fantastic to have a virtual conversation like this. So if I have to give a tip to someone who's a postgraduate clinician, I would say that one of the things I loved as a basic scientist was when the silos of basic science and clinical science broke away and you sat with each other across a bench and communicated. Because it's really when that continuum starts that you inform each other so much, right? And that is rare in our ecosystem in India, partly because MD PhDs are rare in our ecosystem, and because medical schools are segregated from universities and research institutions. And this is a historical feature. But there is, for the younger generation, there's an opportunity to break away from these silos and to sort of recreate and reimagine a way of creating a continuum from basic research to clinical research and dialogue back and forth. So that would be something I would definitely say to the younger community. You will shape sort of how clinical research emerges in the country in the next sort of 50 years. Break the silos. And once you break the silos, exciting things happen in science and happen in the discovery process. So that would be one thing. And two, I would say that when you're talking about anxiety, depression, and mental health, a large part of our sense of well-being comes from not having had this tackled or handled. And at the end of the day, when you're dealing with a patient who has PCOS, you're also dealing with their fundamental well-being as a human being, not simply normalizing all their measures, biochemical measures, and perhaps ensuring the cosmetic changes are handled. but the fact that they feel well. And feeling well, a huge component of that is their mental health. And so what Dr. Anuja mentioned at the beginning, keep this in mind when you're handling your patient as well, that well-being is going to impact multiple other dimensions of their recovery process as well. So that would be the tip, and it's going to be an exciting journey forward once India starts opening itself up to cross collaborations and MD PhD programs. We'll start seeing more and more exciting collaborations emerging. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's been such a brilliant discussion. I've truly enjoyed it. It's so far away from what we used to hear when we were students and when we were, going into post graduation. As a matter of fact, my husband wanted to be a psychiatrist, if you please, and his father said, "No, all the psychiatrists look mad. I don't want you to become mad." So, what I'm trying to tell you is that it is such a different thought process today on what is mental health. And yes, WHO has also said that being healthy is also having mental health intact, and that is what you call being healthy. So mental health is included even by WHO in well-being. And I think the whole concept of how mental health affects PCOS women, both in terms of causing the problem or being the effect of the problem. I think a lot of work still needs to be done, but thank you so much for being with us today and spending your time and giving us your expertise. We've truly enjoyed it. And on behalf of the audience and myself, I really thank you and appreciate you being with us. I also thank the audience for joining us in, and we will keep you updated if there are any questions coming in later. I hope our speakers won't mind answering them. We'll forward it to you. And I would like to thank DocMode, who has offered us this platform totally without any charges, and we really owe a lot to them. Thank you so much for being with us today. And viewers, we look forward to seeing you again for the 4th episode of the PCOS Science Live. Thank you very much. See you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.